enjoyed what you heard and seen today. It's my honor right now to introduce the first plenary speaker of the Great Lakes Bioneers Chicago. As a young graduate student, I studied with great interest the role that energy budgets played in the successful survival of species. The survival of each organism depended upon its energy intake and the careful allocation of this energy to the critical tasks of finding food, creating shelter, escaping from predators, coping with environmental fluctuations, growing, reproducing, rearing young. Each species characterized by a series of energy allocation strategies pre-programmed into their DNA that maximized its probability of success. Indeed, in nature, species survival depends on a judicious and sustainable use of energy resources. The fossil fuel age, although relatively new in human history, has given our species the ability to disconnect for a time from the reality of nature's economy. In arrogance and delusion, we build an industrial economy based on the premise of an endless and ever-growing supply of fossil fuels. Despite the stark reality of a rapidly warming planet, the result of decades of profligate fossil fuel consumption and the availability of alternative options, we as a nation seem to intent on doubling down on our commitment to fossil fuel use. In what some have called extreme energy, we're now blowing up mountains, subsiding farmland, injecting chemicals into the ground, and drilling miles below ocean floors, reaching harder and harder to fulfill a growing addiction for a finite resource. Short-term thinking at its best, hardly sustainable. Indeed, from a long-term perspective of species survival, foolhardy. As we enter the general election, both political parties promise a resurgence of economic prosperity based on fossil fuel and a smooth transition to an abundant energy future via emerging technologies. But before we bet our future on this, we'd better do our homework. Too much is at stake. Our keynote speaker this evening comes to us from Santa Rosa, California. He's a senior fellow in residence at the Post-Carbon Institute. It's a think tank providing analysis and emerging responses and strategies to climate change, energy scarcity, overconsumption, economics, and other issues related to sustainability and the long-term social resilience. He's written extensively on global energy future, the urgent and unavoidable need to transition away from fossil fuels, and the likely impacts that this transition will have on our food, transportation, and economic systems. Indeed, life as we know it. He's the author of 10 books, including The Party's Over, Power Down, Peak Everything, and his most recent, The End of Growth, which addresses the converging challenges of resource depletion, environmental degradation, and financial constraints, and the inevitable changes that will occur in the way we live. Life after growth, why the economy is shrinking, and what to do about it. Please welcome Richard Heinberg.
Thanks so much, Lynn. Well, I'm going to be talking with you I'm going to try and do this in about 40 minutes so that we can have plenty of time for questions. And since this is a handheld mic, I'm going to use this rather than I find these work better. I have a cold, and if I need to cough. Anyway. I'm going to be talking about economic growth. And economic growth is, as we all know, a good thing. Every politician, every economist tells us so. And in fact, we're told constantly that economic growth has been going on for a long time. It'll go on endlessly in the future, and it always makes us better off. I'm going to challenge all of those assumptions this evening, and in the process, help us see that there is life after growth. So I'm not getting slide to change. Is there a secret to using the slide changer? Right button? Yeah. Taint happening. At the projector. No. Usually it's a matter of pointing it at the computer. Okay, well now, got it happening. First of all, has economic growth been going on for a very long time? Well, actually, no. Here we see world GDP per capita. By the way, that's how we measure economic growth, is in terms of GDP, gross domestic product, which is basically just the total amount of money being spent in the economy on an annual basis. As we can see, over the last 1,000 years, even as empires rose and fell, there was virtually no change in GDP until we get to the last couple of hundred years. Of course, the last couple of hundred years are also remarkable for other reasons. World population has increased from under 1 billion in 1800 to over 7 billion today. That's just 200 years. So that's an extraordinary rate of population increase. If we saw that in any other species, we'd say, wow, that species is headed for a crash. But we don't think that when we see human population numbers. We look at that and we say, oh, wow, how successful we are. A third trend that's related is energy consumption. And energy consumption over these last 200 years has also exploded. Now, I would argue that this third trend is the driver of the other two. And I'll get back to that in a minute and explain why I think that's the case. But before we get there, I want to share with you how I came to have these concerns about economic growth. They actually have roots that go way back. When I was 21 years old, I read this book, Limits to Growth. It was published in 1972. It went on to become the best-selling environmental book of all time. You may have heard that Limits to Growth has somehow been discredited. That's certainly not the case. Actually, it's been the victim of a targeted public relations campaign. What it was really was just an effort to use computers to model the likely interactions between population, resources, and environmental damage. Okay, so it wasn't an effort to foretell the future per se. It was a modeling and scenario exercise. Can we model how these variables are likely to interact over time? Whoa, how did we get back there? So this was the standard run scenario back in 1972, which tended to show a peak and decline in world industrial output sometime in the first half of the 21st century. Now, of course, this was an unwelcome outcome, and so that was the main reason the conclusions were attacked so vociferously. But the primary scientific research organization in Australia, the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, CSIRO, did a retrospective analysis a few years ago of the Limits to Growth study, and this was the conclusion they came up with. 30 years of historical data compares favorably with the standard run scenario. I guess the good news there is that we're right on track. We're doing a good job. I don't know if how well you can see this back there, but this is actually the comparing the trends, the historical trends with the standard run scenario. And it's a pretty close fit. Obviously, it's not an exact fit, but it's not far off the mark. So where are we now? year 2012, we're coming up to the period of where the Limits to Growth study forecast a peak and decline in world industrial output. Now, I think this is actually exactly what we're seeing right now and have been since 2008 or before. But the signals are being ignored or misinterpreted. I want to unpack those signals with you in the next few minutes using these three factors. Now, not all of them were discussed in the Limits to Growth scenario study. Energy and environment were, but not specifically climate change and not debt. There was a deliberate decision on the part of the authors of the study to exclude the financial system from consideration in the other more environmental factors. But as we've found during these past 4 years, you can't really do that. You can't exclude the financial system from our analysis. So we'll put that back in. First of all, energy. As I suggested earlier, energy is the driver of everything. Why? Because it takes energy to do literally everything we do. And if you have lots of cheap energy, you can do things that you couldn't do before. And that's basically what's happened to us over the past couple of hundred years. We've always used energy, but it previously had been in the forms of, food and firewood. We'd exerted energy into our environment by way of muscle power, either human or animal. But with fossil fuels, we gained access to energy sources that had been produced over the course of tens of millions of years through processes into which we had to invest no effort whatsoever. Highly concentrated, portable energy sources. Think about it this way. Maybe you've had the experience of running out of gas in your car and having to push your car 10 feet off to the side of the road. It's a fair amount of work, right? Now imagine pushing your car for, let's say, 25 or 30 miles. How much work is that? Well, if you do the math, of course, it depends on whether the extent to which you're using your arm or leg muscles and how big a person you are, how big the car is, and so on. But it's a pretty fair estimate to say it's a couple of months of hard labor pushing your car 30 miles. Well, we get that done for us with a single gallon of gas for which we're paying less than $4 and complaining. You can't get labor that cheap anywhere on the planet. And of course, that's why we have mechanized every process of production and transport that we possibly could over the past few decades, and that's given us enormous economic growth. But oil, which is economically the most crucial of the fossil fuels because it represents virtually all of transport energy, oil, like the other fossil fuels, is non-renewable and depleting. We've learned that in this country. This is where the oil industry started. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, we were the world's foremost oil exporting nation. More than half the world's oil was coming from oil fields in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Texas, California, places like that. But discoveries of oil reached a maximum around 1930 and have generally been declining since then. Actual production of oil, or extraction of oil, as I prefer to say, in the US has been declining since 1970. We've had some good luck the last few years as a result of applying extraordinary technologies to low-quality reservoirs in places like North Dakota. But we still have a long way to go to catch up to where we were in 1970, and we certainly won't get there. We won't see a new peak in US oil production. Now, this same peaking and decline phenomenon that we've seen here in the US is being mimicked in country after country around the world. Countries that used to be oil exporting nations are now oil importing nations. Indonesia, Great Britain. World oil discoveries have been declining since about 1964. So it's not just a couple of years of bad luck. This is a long-established trend. Actual world crude oil production has been flat since 2005. And that's in the context of very high oil prices. So there's every incentive for oil producers to bring as much to market as they possibly can. But again, actual production has stalled out. Why so? Well, it's because the oil industry has changed so much, so fast. This is what it looked like back in the 1930s. This is what it looks like today when a single exploratory oil well in ultra-deep water can cost $500 million to drill and still come up dry. The industry needs high oil prices in order to justify applying these extraordinary new technologies to the kinds of reservoirs that are left, which are certainly not the best. We've gone about extracting fossil fuels using the low-hanging fruit principle. So we got the cheap, easy stuff early in the game. What's left is basically the dregs. So the industry needs high oil prices, and that's what we've been seeing. But high oil prices have an economic impact. And we've been seeing that since the 1970s, since the first oil crisis of 1973. Every time we've had an oil price spike, we've had a recession immediately follow. Now, here's our situation today in a nutshell. The industry needs prices in the range of $100 a barrel, and the global price of oil is still over $100 a barrel right now. The industry needs prices in that range in order to justify going out and fracking or deep water drilling